March 1954. A valley in northern Vietnam. 15,000 French soldiers are completely surrounded, slowly being shelled into the ground, and the most powerful nation on earth is being asked to save them. The French government wasn't making a polite request. They were begging. They needed American aircraft carriers. They needed bombers. They needed intervention within days, or an entire garrison would be lost. The pressure on President Dwight Eisenhower was enormous. His own military advisors, the National Security Council, and most of the Joint Chiefs, they all had plans ready. The carriers were already in the region. Strikes could begin within 48 hours, and Eisenhower said no. To understand why, you have to go back to how this disaster was built, one preposterous assumption at a time. In late 1953, the French flew 15,000 troops into a valley called Dien Bien Phu, near the Laotian border in northern Vietnam. The man behind the plan was General Henri Navarre. His thinking was straightforward, at least on paper. He believed the fortress would draw Viet Minh forces into open battle. The French had superior artillery. They had air power. They had conventional military doctrine on their side. What Navarre did not account for was the ground beneath his feet. The fortress sat in a valley, surrounded entirely by hills. Anyone who understood terrain could see the problem immediately. You don't build a defensive position at the bottom of a bowl and expect the enemy to walk through the front door. The Viet Minh commander, General Vo Nguyen Giap, understood exactly what the French had done. They had built a trap for themselves. Giap spent months doing something the French believed was physically impossible. He moved heavy artillery through dense jungle terrain, piece by piece, hauling guns up hillsides that military planners had dismissed as impassable. By the time the French realized what was happening, Giap had positioned over 200 artillery pieces in the surrounding hills. This included Soviet-built rocket launchers the French had a name for. They called them Stalin organs. By March 1954, the valley was sealed. Viet Minh artillery could hit any position inside Dien Bien Phu. French aircraft attempting to resupply the garrison were being shot down in approach. The 15,000 men inside weren't fighting anymore. They were surviving, barely, while being slowly starved and shelled into submission. Now, you might be wondering why this moment landed on Eisenhower's desk with such force. 2 months earlier, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had delivered what many considered the most significant foreign policy speech of the entire Eisenhower presidency. He introduced a new doctrine to the world, massive retaliation. The idea was simple and deliberately frightening. The United States would not try to match communist forces, soldier for soldier, gun for gun, in every corner of the globe. Instead, America would retaliate instantly, by means and at places of its own choosing. The implication was clear. Nuclear weapons were on the table. Alongside this doctrine lived another idea, the domino theory. Lose Vietnam and the rest of Southeast Asia would fall to communism, one country tipping the next like dominoes in a line. The political pressure to act was immense. Admiral Radford already had the military plan drawn up. The USS Essex and the USS Boxer were positioned in the region. Strikes could launch in 48 hours. But Eisenhower had something most of the men in that room did not have. He had a memory. Eisenhower had commanded the largest military operation in human history. He had stood on maps and sent men to die on the beaches of Normandy. He understood, at a level that went beyond strategy and doctrine, what it actually cost to put soldiers on the ground. And he had been watching France in Vietnam since 1946. He saw clearly what many in Washington refused to say out loud. The French were not fighting for democracy. They were fighting to preserve their empire. And the Vietnamese, even those with no love for communism, deeply hated French colonial rule. America had already funded 80% of France's war in Vietnam, and France, with 200,000 troops on the ground, was still losing. Then came the voice that mattered most in that room. Army Chief of Staff Matthew Ridgway had commanded forces in Korea. He knew what a land war in Asia looked like up close. Ridgway told Eisenhower directly, airstrikes alone would accomplish nothing. The Viet Minh would retreat into the jungle and simply wait for the aircraft to leave. If America truly wanted to save the French position, it would require American ground troops. Ridgway's estimate was 7 divisions, at minimum. If China entered the war, as it had in Korea, the number jumped to 12. Vietnam's terrain was worse than Korea's. The supply lines would be nearly impossible to maintain. That number, 7 divisions, stayed in the room long after Ridgway finished speaking. Eisenhower called a full cabinet meeting on April 3, 1954. He needed to know if Congress would support military intervention. Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson and House Speaker Sam Rayburn gave him their answer. Congress would support military action under one condition. America's allies had to participate. It could not be an American operation alone. Dulles flew to London to meet Winston Churchill, 79 years old and serving his second term as Prime Minister. Churchill had been the one who coined the phrase about the Iron Curtain. He understood the communist threat, as well as anyone alive, but Churchill told Dulles that Britain would not join. He was not willing to commit British forces to a war in Indochina. The condition Congress had set could not be met. On April the 26th, 1954, Eisenhower made his decision final. There would be no American military intervention at Dien Bien Phu. On May 7, 1954, the fortress fell. After 56 days of siege, the entire French garrison surrendered. Over 2,000 French soldiers were dead. Other 11,000 became prisoners of war. It was one of the most complete military collapses of the 20th century. Representatives from France, Vietnam, the United States, China, and the Soviet Union gathered in Geneva. They negotiated the future of Indochina. Vietnam would be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. The North would be governed by Ho Chi Minh's communist government. The South would be governed by a pro-Western administration. Elections were scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country. Those elections never happened. In January 1955, Eisenhower authorized the first shipment of military aid to the newly created South Vietnam. He also sent military advisors to train the South Vietnamese army. By the end of his presidency, in January 1961, there were approximately 900 American military personnel in South Vietnam. When John F. Kennedy took office, he increased that number to 16,000 advisors. By 1963, after Kennedy's assassination in November of that same year, Lyndon Johnson inherited the same unresolved situation and escalated it further. By 1968, more than 500,000 American troops were fighting in Vietnam. That was the equivalent of 27 divisions. Ridgway had estimated 7. The war Eisenhower refused to fight in 1954 ultimately killed 58,000 Americans. It cost over $140 billion. It lasted until 1975. Here is the part that stays with you. Eisenhower has often been criticized for what he didn't do in 1954, for walking away, for letting the French fall. But the man who had sent soldiers to die on Normandy understood something that the pressure of the moment was trying to make everyone forget. Saving 15,000 French soldiers in a valley was not the real question. The real question was what came next, and he could see it clearly. 7 divisions, 12 divisions, jungles worse than Korea, a colonial war with no legitimate foundation, and an enemy willing to wait for as long as it took. He chose not to intervene, and history, in one of its most painful ironies, proved that what followed his restraint was far worse than what he feared. The war he refused became the war that defined a generation, just fought by someone else a decade later at a cost no one in 1954 had fully allowed themselves to imagine. If you found this story worth thinking about, like the video and subscribe to the channel so you keep receiving stories told this way.